Hello everyone, welcome back to Tuition Masters, and today we are here with session number 2 for life processes. And in the today's session we are going to discuss about respiration. So this is a part 1 of respiration. Let's see, in our last session we did about an introduction and nutrition. Today we are going to study about respiration. Now, in respiration, what all topics are we going to cover? We are going to cover introduction to respiration, the types of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic, and ATP. And these remaining topics are going to cover in our next session. So, students, let's start with an introduction to respiration. We know that in our last session we studied that nutrition, isn't it? So, it was related to our food. So, whenever we eat food, it is converted into energy. Now, what is that process known as? So, how is food converted to energy now? So, basically, when I talk about respiration, we even call it as cellular respiration. What happens is any food material which we eat, it is oxidized with or without the presence of oxygen and it gives us energy. So, we eat food. Why do we eat food? The major use of food is for getting energy. Now, that energy is obtained by the process of respiration. So, energy from the food is given to us by the process of respiration. Now, carbohydrates. When carbohydrates is digested, it gives us glucose. For example, if we eat banana, so banana is approximately 17 grams of carbohydrates. So these carbohydrates break into simple molecules. It breaks into simple molecules and turn into glucose, which goes in the bloodstream. Now, if you eat a naan bread or if you eat a chapati, what happens? There are more carbohydrates. Now they also broken. There is more amount of glucose. Correct. There is more amount of glucose now which enters the blood, and with this, what do we get? Ultimately, we get energy. So basically, cellular respiration is responsible for providing us energy. So how do we define the chemical formula? So respiration can be defined as the process of breakdown of glucose to release energy. So when glucose breaks down more ahead and gives us energy. So what is it? Glucose plus oxygen means glucose, when it breaks down in the presence of oxygen, it gives out carbon dioxide, water, as well as energy. Now in terms of chemical, how will I write? I'll write glucose C6 H12O6 plus 6 molecules of oxygen. When C6H12O6 is breaking down in the presence of oxygen, I will get 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of H2O. So I will get glucose, when it breaks down in the presence of oxygen, gives me carbon dioxide, water, plus energy. Now, cellular respiration is what cells do to break up the sugars. Now, whatever sugars are there, cellular means obviously we're talking about the cells over here. So, cells, they break up these sugars into such a form that we can use it as an energy. So that these sugars can be intaken as an energy form, right? The sugars can be broken down in simple forms and energy can be obtained from that. So this happens in all forms of life, plants, animals, everywhere it happens. Okay, now cellular respiration takes in food and uses it to create ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Now what is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate is ATP. We are going to study a very detailed information about ATP ahead. So now when I talk about types of cellular respiration, so there are two cellular respiration. First one is aerobic, second one is anaerobic. You might have studied this in grade 7 also. So aerobic respiration, it requires oxygen. Oxygen is used for the breakdown of food, so that the food is broken down. For the breakdown, oxygen is required in aerobic and it produces 36 molecules of ATP. But when I talk about anaerobic respiration, it does not use oxygen. Oxygen is not required and it produces less ATP. Okay. Now, Let's study about aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now, when I talk about the types of respiration, as I said, cellular respiration, we talk about aerobic here. Aerobic respiration consists of three processes. First process is glycolysis, second is Krebs cycle, and third one is oxidative phosphorylation. So these are the processes we have to study. Now, in aerobic respiration, what does aerobic respiration means? So aerobic respiration is a process producing cellular energy involving oxygen. This means that oxygen is needed. Oxygen is needed in aerobic respiration, because in aerobic respiration the food is broken down in the presence of oxygen. Next, cells break down food in the mitochondria in a long multi-step process that produces roughly 36 ATP. We know mitochondria. So, when I talk about mitochondria, what is the mitochondria? We know, you might have studied it last year in your chapter Fundamental Unit of Life. Mitochondria is nothing but the powerhouse of cell. Correct. It is the powerhouse of the cell. Why? Because it produces ATP. It produces energy. So basically, the cells break down the food where they go in the mitochondria and break down the food, and then mitochondria in aerobic respiration produces roughly 36 ATP. Now, as I said, there are steps involved in aerobic respiration. First one is glycolysis, then try carboxylic acid cycle, which is known as TCA, and electron transfer chain (ETC) reaction. So let's understand about them. Stage number one is glycolysis. Glyco and lysis. There are two words: glycose, glucose. That means it is sugar, and lysis again. Electrolysis, glucolysis. So lysis obviously means splitting. So means when sugar are splitted, or we can name it as sugar breakdown. So sugar breakdown is known as the glycolysis. Now, where does it takes place? It takes place in the cytoplasm. It takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, glycolysis is the first step of cellular respiration. Correct. Now, this step is common in aerobic also and anaerobic also. It's not only present in aerobic respiration; it's present both in aerobic also and anaerobic also. Now, it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cells of all living organism and does not require oxygen. So basically, glycolysis, here it takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. Correct. Cytoplasm is what? It is the liquid, the jelly like substance. Correct. The liquid substance, the jelly liquid kind of substance, where the organelles float, that is my cytoplasm. So in there, glycolysis takes place. Now, oxygen is not required, but it occurs even in aerobic and anaerobic. Both places it occurs, and oxygen is not required for it. Now, what happens is glucose, which contains six carbon molecules. Now, in the cytoplasm, what happens? Glycolysis takes place. Then, what glucose is converted into two molecules. First one is pyruvate, and second one is energy. So, pyruvate and energy is produced when glucose is broken down by glycolysis. Now, how do we explain this formula? 6 carbon compound of glucose, it is oxidized or it is glycolized in a step by step manner to form two molecules of 3 carbon compound known as pyruvate, or you can even say pyruvic acid. That is nothing but glucose is broken down into simpler products. So these 6 carbon molecules, they break down and become into 3 carbon molecules, and that 3 carbon molecule wala protein, or acid is known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Now, glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of all living cells. The cells which are living, every cell has a cytoplasm, so glycolysis takes place there. It does not require oxygen, as I said, no need of oxygen. And many anaerobic organisms that do not use oxygen also have this pathway. Now the organisms that do not use oxygen also, they also use the process of what, use the process of glycolysis. So this was the process of glycolysis. Right now, next is the EMP pathway again of glycolysis. Why EMP? It only process to occur in anaerobic conditions. It will only occur in anaerobic condition, but it can even happen in aerobic. Glycolysis takes place in all living cells. Now it is even known as the EMP pathway. Why? Because it was found, it was like, worked by three people: Emden, Meyerhoff, and Parnas. So EMP, from the first letter, this name is taken. Stage number two is the Krebs cycle. What is Krebs cycle? It's an interesting cycle. Understand very clearly. When I talk about Krebs cycle, it is the next phase of aerobic respiration. Now that is also known as the citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, they are one and the same thing. So Krebs cycle needs oxygen. Glycolysis, no oxygen. Krebs cycle, oxygen is required. Now, the pyruvate molecule. What happened? We remember that when glucose was broken down, we got the pyruvate, isn't it? We got the pyruvate molecule, which consisted of how many? How they consisted of three carbon molecules, isn't it? Three carbon molecules are present in the pyruvate. Now, what happens to this pyruvate is, from the glycolysis, it enters the matrix of a mitochondrion. Means it enters the inner part of a mitochondria, the pyruvate molecule. Now, what happens in eukaryotic cells? In eukaryotic cell, Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria. If I said more detail, it occurs in the matrix of mitochondria. But prokaryotes, if I talk about them, see here. I'll take a blank slide. Give me 1 second. See this. Now, if you see here, so what happens is, exactly, let's understand the location over here. The location of Krebs cycle. Now, what is the location of? We're talking about the Krebs cycle. Okay, Krebs cycle. Now, see the students. What happens is, when I talk about eukaryotes, now, why am I taking it differently? Why I'm taking eukaryotes and prokaryotes separately? Because eukaryotes have the molecules and everything, but I mean the organelles, but the prokaryotes don't contain it. So when I talk about the eukaryotic cell, the Krebs cycle takes place. It takes place where? In the matrix. In the matrix of which thing? In the matrix of mitochondria. Okay, in the matrix of mitochondrion or mitochondria, one and the same thing, it occurs, isn't it? Now, on my other hand, I have prokaryotes. Now, what happens about prokaryotes? Now, prokaryotes, they do not have their primitive cells, they do not have the mitochondria, so there is no mitochondria present here, isn't it? So I'll write over here, there is no mitochondria. Correct, there is no mitochondria. But Krebs cycle respiration will even occur in prokaryotic cells. So where will it occur? So it will occur, so the Krebs cycle will take place, it takes place in the cytoplasm. Now, cytoplasm is present in all cells. So that is why in prokaryotic cells, in the cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle will take place. And when I talk about glycolysis, it takes place in cytoplasm only, even for eukaryotes. So coming back, we discussed where it takes place. So in the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate is broken down into many molecules like ATP, CO2, NAD, NADH, FADH2, then oxaloacetic acid, then citric acid. It's broken down in these many parts. Okay, that you'll understand more in 11, 12. So no, just have to do the surface covering. Okay. So this was about the Krebs cycle. After the Krebs cycle comes the ETC, electron transport chain. Now what happened here is that the products of the Krebs cycle moves to the electron transport chain. Now the electron transport chain, it is a series of proteins and organic molecules which is found in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. In the inner membrane of the mitochondria, there are series of proteins that are known as the ETC. Now all these products, FADH2, FAD, CO2, 1-ATP, NAD, citric acid, oxaloacetic acid, then COA, all of these things come in this ETC part. Now they are now transported to the ETC. Okay, so next part is what, see here, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So when we talk about this, we are talking about ATP now. So when I talk about ATP, ATP is produced in the aerobic respiration, correct? In aerobic respiration, it's produced. So in cytoplasm, this glucose, six carbon molecules of glucose is broken down by the process of glycolysis, and two ATPs are produced. Now, when these two pyruvate molecules go in the Krebs cycle, again two ATPs are produced. At the end, in the mitochondria, everything is occurring. After that, when ETC, electron transport chain, is occurring, 32 are there. So in total, how many molecules? In total, 36 ATP is produced. Roughly 36 molecules of ATP are produced. Now, as we studied, pyruvate that is produced during glycolysis, it is a versatile molecule. It feeds into numerous pathways. It can even enter the pathways for both aerobic as well as anaerobic respiration. It can even occur in aerobic and anaerobic also. It's there in lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, and aerobic respiration. These places the pyruvate molecules are produced. Alright. Now, when let's talk about alcoholic fermentation, the process where the microorganisms convert sugar into an acid or an alcohol, it is called as fermentation. Fermenting. You might have studied, right? Some microorganisms ferment the things into acid or alcohol. That is known as alcoholic fermentation. Now when I talk about anaerobic respiration, it is an anaerobic pathway, okay, where oxygen is not required. There the breaking down of glucose is performed by different types of organisms and cells. For example, in the absence of oxygen, yeast cells do the fermentation. So this pyruvate molecule is broken down into ethanol, carbon dioxide, and energy, which in turn gives me a alcohol, isn't it? So it gives me alcohol. So pyruvate molecule is broken down in anaerobic respiration, which gives me fermentation. So secondly, lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid, what is it? Now muscle cramps. Why do muscle cramps occur? When muscle cells undergo sudden activity, okay, and do not get sufficient oxygen to respire. So what happens? The it muscle cramps occur. So what happens is when you are suddenly doing some activity with your muscle, like you're running or you're picking up heavy weights, so you may get muscle cramps. So that occurs because there's no sufficient oxygen for respiration. So what happens is it is due to the lack of oxygen. So muscle cells convert pyruvate into lactic acid now. So what happens here is pyruvate, the pyruvate molecule, it converts into lactic acid. Correct. It converts into the lactic acid where carbon dioxide and water is not given. Lactic acid is given. Now this accumulation of lactic acid will cause a muscle cramp. So pyruvate can even produce alcohol. It can even produce lactic acid. Now when, as I said, pyruvate molecule, what happens, the reaction is the pyruvate molecule when there is no oxygen, okay, in muscles it occurs, okay, in the muscles when there is no oxygen and it needs to respire, so pyruvate converts into the lactic acid and even gives out energy, so the muscle cramps are reduced. Now, as I said, types of respiration in cytoplasm, where there are six carbon molecules of glucose, what happens, it converts into pyruvate. Now, pyruvate contains a three carbon molecules, isn't it? Plus energy. Now, when there is no oxygen, okay, there is no oxygen in yeast, what happens? It's produced alcohol. It produces alcohol, ethanol plus carbon dioxide plus energy, which is a two carbon molecule. After that, when there is lack of oxygen, means where there is less oxygen, not no oxygen, okay, where there is less oxygen in the muscles, the it converts, the pyruvate converts into lactic acid to produce the energy in muscles, correct? So avoid the muscle cramps. Again, that is a three carbon molecule. Now, when oxygen is present, oxygen is sufficiently present, so in mitochondria, carbon dioxide plus water plus energy is produced, which does the respiration. So, see, we can get to know here that pyruvate, a single pyruvate can do so many functions. So, now, what is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? This is a, five marker question. It's a 5 mark question which can come in your exam. That is differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now, aerobic respiration it occurs in all living cells of higher organisms who are advanced. Anaerobic, where oxygen is not required, it occurs only in yeast and some other microorganisms. Now, aerobic respiration requires oxygen, whereas anaerobic doesn't require the oxygen. Now, in aerobic respiration, the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water, and in anaerobic, it is alcohol, CO2, or lactic acid, any of these we produce. In aerobic respiration, we after the respiration is done, oxidation is done, we get 36 ATP molecules. But in anaerobic, less molecules are produced, that is, only 2 ATPs are produced. In anaerobic, it occurs in the cytoplasm and mitochondria, whereas anaerobic occurs only in the cytoplasm. So, this is your 5 marker question. Make sure to take a screenshot and remember the whole thing. Now, moving towards the last topic of the day is ATP. Now, what is this ATP here? Let's understand about it in detail. Now, ATP, it is the energy which is released during the respiration, whether it be anaerobic or aerobic. Aerobic produces more, anaerobic produces less, but both of them produces ATP. So, energy is released during respiration. That energy is used to synthesize ATP, means make ATP. What is ATP? It is nothing but adenosine triphosphate. So, what is the role of ADP? It is the energy release. So, the when energy is released, it is used to synthesize the ATP. Now, we know that food is broken down in the presence of oxygen. When oxygen is there, aerobic respiration through that the food is broken down. To what happens is it converts the food energy into ATP inside the cells. When it is occurring inside the cell, means inside the mitochondrion, that means it is undergoing cellular respiration. So, cellular respiration in animal cell, it occurs specifically only in the mitochondria. We studied the whole process before, and in that mitochondria produces my ATP. Okay, that is adenosine triphosphate for the energy of life processes. But the question comes, how does oxygen, which is required for the cellular respiration, even reaches the cells of the body? So basically, ATP it acts as a fuel to carry out activities within the cell. So within the cell, whatever activities are there, ATP helps to do that. And if there is ATP in good amount, so you are fully charged. Now, the energy which is released during the process of respiration, it is used to make an ATP molecules from ADP and inorganic phosphate. What is ADP? ADP is adenosine diphosphate. Means there are two molecules. See this. It's a good process here. You see. Let's take a blank slide and explain you. So, talking about ATP, how is ATP produced actually? Now, when I talk about ATP, the main thing which occurs firstly, the when energy is provided. Okay, when energy is respiration occurs, what happens is there is ADP. There is ADP. That is what adenosine diphosphate. It is adenosine diphosphate. Now, when I say diphosphate, that means there are only what? There are only two molecules of two molecules of phosphate. Only two molecules of phosphate are present in ADP. Okay, in ADP only two molecules of inorganic phosphate is there. But now, when when respiration is completed, there is one more molecule of inorganic phosphate. So one more molecule of inorganic phosphate is added. Okay, inorganic phosphate. It is added. Now, so this ATP, now there were before only there were what? There were only three molecules of protein, only two molecules of protein were there. That made the ADP, adenosine diphosphate, because there are two phosphate molecules. Now what happens is it converts into ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. Why triphosphate? Because now when ADP, the inorganic phosphate is added, it converts into three molecules of phosphate. So when there are three molecules of phosphate, it turns into ATP, and that time the cell is fully charged. Okay. So endothermic processes in the cell, then use this ATP to drive the reactions. So the endothermic reactions which occurs where heat is taken in, so that time ATP is used. Now when the terminal phosphate linkage in the ATP is broken, using the water, the energy equivalent to, that is the energy which is given out, that is equivalent to 30.5 kilojoules per mole. Okay, it is released. So what happens is, when this ATP, when the ATP which has three molecules, that is, sorry, not ADP, sorry, ATP. So when this ATP which has three molecules is broken down into ADP plus the phosphate molecule, so what happens, I even get some amount of energy, even energy is produced, right? So that energy is equivalent to 30.5 kilojoules per mole. Okay, per mole this much energy is produced. So when ATP is broken down into ADP in the presence of water, so ADP plus phosphate is given out in endothermic reactions. Now, ATP is known as the energy currency. It is the money currency of energies. Why? Because the cell as like the currency, it can be used to fill any energy need of the cell. Now for example, if you don't have food in your home, what you'll do, you will with the you will take some money and you will buy some food. Similarly, when the cell has no energy, so ATP will you give the energy, so that is the energy currency. So students, this was all about today's session. Let's quickly summarize what all things we studied today. So we studied that during the process of respiration, organic compounds such as glucose are broken down to provide energy in the form of ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It is the energy currency. It is used to provide energy for other reactions. Now, respiration are of two types. Aerobic, it is of two types, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration makes up more energy. Aerobic respiration gives 36 molecules of ATP, whereas anaerobic is only 2 molecules. So muscle cramps, so we even studied about pyruvate. So pyruvate molecule which is produced in glycolysis, in yeast, it can even be used in yeast, which gives us alcohol. Correct, it gives alcohol. Then when it occurs in our muscles, when it occurs in muscles, it provides us lactic acid. Correct, it does the lactic acid thing. And then when I talk about in the mitochondria, in the mitochondria, what happens there? In the mitochondria, it produces the energy in the form of ATP. ATP is formed by ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus inorganic phosphate, which gives us ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So thank you students so much. We covered this whole part in almost half an hour. So thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe the channel if you didn't do it till now. I'll be seeing you in the next video, and don't forget to download this PDF from the description below, and even fill out the Google forms for live classes of grade 10. I'll be seeing you in the next session. Till then, take care and good.